Okay. I think we're all here, so I think I can go ahead and get started.
Do you want to wait a couple minutes, Alayna, while the people file in? We only have so far. We can wait a minute. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome. As you come in, if you have burning questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. You can always address them during our time together. We'll get started in one more minute. Let's go ahead and start so that way we can make sure to cover as many questions and get good discussion going. So good morning and thank you for coming, everyone, for our second day of our JHU grad camp. I'm going to be your moderator for today's session, which is how not to pay for grad school. So my name is Alayna Hayes, Dr. Alayna Hayes, and I work as the Director of Life Design for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Life Design Lab here at Johns Hopkins. In a moment, I'm going to give a brief introduction of each of our panelists and ask them some questions. I'll also leave time for your questions, so make sure that you drop them into the discussion or the chat, and I'll be checking that periodically. Just to introduce our panel very quickly, we have Dr. Stephon Hamell, who is the Director of Scholars and Fellows and Kessler Scholars Program at Johns Hopkins. Good morning.
Good morning.
We have Sara Carioscia. I still think I said it wrong, but I'm working on it. I am so sorry. Who's our biology PhD candidate. So she has some great info to share as well. And then Dr. Justin Lorts, who is Director of Life Design for Grad School for the Life Design Lab. So welcome. And so excited to have all of you with us. Again, folks, feel free to drop questions into the discussion or the chat. I'm going to get started just with a very general question. I think anyone can answer this one, just one of you. Can someone briefly describe the difference between internal and external funding sources for grad school? Stephon, you want to give it a shot?
Sure. I will say internal sources of funding for grad school are those that come directly from the institution, either from the department or the program you're applying to or that you've been accepted to. They're often provided on admissions, or there's a process for which you can get it within the first 2 or 3 years, depending upon if you're a PhD student or a master's level student. External funding are those that come from sources that are not the institution or your program or department, largely from a governmental research foundation, a private foundation, or again, from professional associations or professional development grants from other people as well.
Can you talk a little bit more about what kind of scholarships, grants, or fellowships are available to students who are considering grad school? So maybe more of those external funding, and then how do they access them in terms of working with your office?
Yeah, so in our office through the NFP, we compile a database. So there's about, I would say, 600 or so different external opportunities for students to apply to seek funding for graduate level programs. That's dissertation research or for graduate study, so to take a class or pursue a specific degree. I will say specific ones that we work most closely with are those through the NSF. So the National Science Foundation has a graduate research fellowship program that gives 3 years of funding for students. NIH has a post-grad training program that provides 3 years of funding for students that we work with. We also have some other private foundations. So Suros is another one for students who come from immigrant families or first-time new Americans can seek funding for 3 years for graduate study. And the Truman, which is also another fellowship for those interested in public service. So those are the ones we work most closely with. We have internal processes that start generally early fall and are due the early part of the spring, and then students interview and are selected late spring for the upcoming academic year. And then for the other ones, we provide almost like a self-service where you have the database, you can meet with us to talk about matching, to talk about and outline your personal statement draft. And as you get your materials together, we offer one full critique or one review of your application materials before you submit.
Thank you. Future Dr. Sara Carioscia. I want to ask you, because you've been really great about getting funding. Do you have any recommendations for students who maybe want to explore these, kind of how do they get access to these from your perspective, someone who's done it?
Yeah, I think the most helpful thing to me personally is reading the applications of past people who have applied for it. And if you can, reading the reviewers' comments. So the NSF that Stephon mentioned, you get 2 or 3 reviewers and each of them rate the applicant on 2 qualities, I guess. And those are made available to the applicant. So if you just look up like NSF GRFP results or guidance or applications or something, there are a bunch of databases that have the essays of the people, their background, like what subject and stuff, and then their reviewer comments. And so when I applied, I was able to read a lot of other people's reviewer comments and kind of see what sort of really picky things the reviewers are into or not into. So reading the essays and reading the reviewer comments if available, very helpful. The other thing that I found helpful for identifying opportunities is, of course, the spreadsheet that the Life Design Lab has with the external funding opportunities, but also sometimes I like to look at the CVs of people in my field and see what things they've won and add them to my personal spreadsheet, which is, it was an empty Excel sheet. And then I added in the rows from the Life Design one that were applicable to me. And now I add a row anytime I see something that might eventually be relevant to me. And of course, there are ways to find those, like you can look up professional societies that people in your field are in and see what things those societies offer. You can look up the CVs of people and see what they've actually won. You can look at the journals that you are most interested in. If you're looking at your research-based master's program, maybe you have a favorite journal. I have a favorite journal. And if you go to their website, sometimes they have prizes for like best grad student paper of that year or something like that that were published in that journal. So I think one of the things I found most interesting is like using those other people's experiences to like scope the things I'm looking at, because we already have the overlap of being in a similar field with a similar interest. And then I've kind of just let those people do like the scavenging for me, and I'm picking the things that are interesting to me.
A sense. At what point in the process of considering grad school and applying should people start beginning exploring these funding options?
I can go.
Justin, oh yeah, go ahead, Sara. Yeah, go ahead.
I asked a bunch of my friends about this yesterday, and a few of my friends who got fully funded masters on internal funding. So generally, I guess a lot of PhD programs will offer guaranteed internal funding. Sometimes you have to do things to get that funding, like be someone's research assistant or be a TA. Sometimes it's just hard money that you have to do nothing but your own. Master's programs often don't offer guaranteed funding, and you sometimes have to pay tuition. And some of my friends who were in research-based masters got fully funded internal funding before they even went, because they reached out to the professor when they first even started thinking about applying. So like now-ish, if you're going to apply for a November, December deadline. And they like kind of talked about why they were interested in that person's research. Some of the advice I got from my friends to share with you is that they were pretty blunt with the fact that they really preferred to be fully funded and would not be that come. And of course, as good of a fit as you are for the lab kind of shapes the influence that you have. But if you're interested in those kinds of things, it sounds like it's much better to start that conversation sooner, as soon as you have a package that's of yourself that's relevant to those people, because they could probably only have a couple of fully funded master's students. So you want to be one of the first ones to get in that conversation. And then I guess for external grants, Stephon and Justin know more about that timeline.
I would say that, like, the process of thinking about funding should begin at the same time you're thinking about graduate school, right? So as you're looking at graduate schools, you should not just be looking for ones with cool faculty or cool programs, but you should also be, as part of that search process, looking at, what their funding opportunities are. If it's a PhD program, as sort of a full-time research PhD program, it really should be a fully funded program for what is expected to be the length of your time, so generally 5 to 6 years. There might be some variations in how much they pay as a stipend and how much they offer in terms of summer funding, and so there might be variations there. So I would start the research early on. Even for fully funded PhD programs, that should be part of your first step. The other reason I would do that is, and Stephon can talk more about this, a lot of these grants have a very long application timeline. So it's not like, oh, I got into graduate school and I'm going to go for this program at Duke and I make my decision in April. Now let me go find funding. All of those funding opportunities, most of those ships have sailed. You really need to start that process really early on. In some cases, sometimes the funding and if you're looking for these external grants might dictate the school that you end up applying to or going to. So start looking for funding very, very early on in the process.
Anything to add, Stephon?
Yeah, I'd agree with both things what Justin and Sara have said. You start early, and I tell every student the summer before you are set to apply, you should start to compile, to Sara's point, your spreadsheet, and you should have a grad school list. And one of the columns in your grad school list should be what types of funding are available. You should know if there are internal opportunities or external opportunities, and then start to identify which ones you want to apply to. I can say the external space, usually the deadlines for the year you want to attend grad school happen the fall before you get there. So if you're getting in April and wanting to find external funding, by that time, most of the money that's available has been spent. Most people have had submitted budgets and have already decided they're going to spend money in X or Y or Z ways. And so starting early is important. Sometimes even your funding applications will be due before you even hit submit on your graduate school applications because they're portable. So they don't care what school or program you go to as long as you go to a program. So you're applying to funding even before you know for sure that you're going to a program.
And just
That's
quickly,
really helpful.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
But when you apply to grad school in November, December, a lot of the applications ask you, they have like a drop down, like, have you applied to any of the following: NSF, grad fellowship, whatever the other like big ones in your field are. And I had not applied to any, so I had to click none of the above on all of my applications. And I don't know that put me at a deficit, but I feel like it definitely would have been better to have been able to click them, because then they can like include that in their metrics of like, okay, most of our students have applied, so probably maybe one of them will get something. The other thing I saw a lot of on Twitter this year was that students who were waitlisted for their top choice grad program but got a big external funding package kind of were able to use that to say like, I have my own money, will you accept me now? And schools did. So it just kind of gives you another angle for your application if you end up on a wait list that you want to go to.
Makes sense. This sounds like start early then. No waiting until the last minute. Okay. I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about underutilized methods to pay for grad school. So what are some underutilized options to not pay for grad school that some students may not be aware of? Justin, if you want to start.
Yeah, so this mainly applies for master's level programs and in some cases, kind of professional doctorates like EDD. One thing, that I think is a real underutilized resource when people are thinking about graduate school is employee tuition remission. It's one of those things, here at Hopkins, our program is not tuition remission program for employees is not particularly robust, but at other places, Alayna's shaking her head. It's like $5,000 a year. I started working when I first started working at NYU. It covered 100% of tuition remission. So I had a number of people who, really talented people who would come and work in roles that were, sort of admin or receptionist roles, or just kind of basic roles that they had a lot of control over their time. And then in the evenings, got a master's degree in higher education, got a master's degree in public affairs. And, it took them a year or two longer, but they graduated, not having taken on any debt, having gotten some work experience while they were doing it, and in a much better shape financially in terms of being able to explore their options than someone who went into a program, took out $100,000 worth of debt in order to cover their tuition, and then graduated without having built up many work skills. So I really strongly encourage people, especially if you're still kind of considering and sort of thinking about it, to look into working at a university. I love working at a university. I've worked in a university all my life. It's a great place to work, and it's also a good place to build your professional skills and take advantage of those tuition remission options.
I would also add, I know I'm a moderator, but I would also add even some corporations will pay for a graduate degree as well. So just something else to think about too, even working outside of education. But great. Stephon, anything to add in terms of underutilized options to not pay for grad school?
No, I think Justin hit it on the nail on the head here of getting the tuition remission programs. But I would add, particularly for students who are in the STEM majors, that if you're going to a campus and you're a master's level student, don't be afraid to be a graduate assistant, like a graduate assistant head resident, where you could potentially get tuition remission plus housing, right? So there are ways to offset your cost. We see it a lot for individuals working and want to go into higher ed or education in different ways. They'll go work in student activities and do a programming board, but the STEM students can also do the same thing. And if you've been involved as an undergrad, you're even more of an impressive candidate for someone hiring a grad assistant at the graduate level.
Anything you'd like to add about kind of underutilized things that you've seen or folks that are tapping in?
I had been thinking about the tuition remission because my undergrad has a really robust program, but I actually just asked a friend who did it whether it's exclusive to folks who went there for undergrad, which I think would be kind of dumb, but I'm not sure. But it just seems worthwhile. Like that wasn't advertised to me as an undergrad that was even a thing that I could have done at Georgetown. And I've had a bunch of friends go through the MBA program and stuff like that at this point. And there, the setup is like you have to work for a year and then you can start your program, but you keep working full time. So you get your salary and you do your program at night, like Justin described, and it's free. I think it's entirely free. But yeah, that wasn't even advertised to us. So I think if you're considering a university, it would be really worthwhile to specifically ask about that. Absolutely. I don't know what rock I was under, but yeah.
That's okay. You learn and you do better as you grow, right? We do have a question in the chat that kind of speaks towards external funding. So I want to make sure to address this and also encourage those to keep dropping your questions in there. But the question is, how long does external funding last? Is it also 5 to 6 years?
I would say it depends on the source. And on average, most external funding, it has about a year to 3 years maximum sort of lifespan. The 5 to 6 years, usually you'd have to get another award. I will say once you've had one award, you're more likely to get an additional award later on. So getting one early sets you up for better success later on down the line.
Else to add, anybody?
And generally speaking, like if you come into a PhD program and having secured an external award for say 2 years, it's not like the school cuts you off after that. Very often a school will kind of, still give you whatever package they were going to give you and potentially extend the amount of, you might get 7 years worth of funding, 2 of those being from the external grant. So it's not like you have to, if you're going the external grant route, figuring out a way to put together 6 years of funding. Those 2, if you're doing a PhD, the very often the school will kind of add to your funding, or at least not cut you off.
Thank you. So now thinking about kind of other costs, even when you are funded. So maybe outside of just funding, tuition and things, but like there are obviously other things to pay for. What types of side hustles or other work can grad or professional students take advantage of to cover other costs besides tuition? I think Justin, you may have something to add here.
So I think there's a lot that you can do, and one of the challenges I think, when I was in the PhD program, I was what they would call I got full funding, which meant that I got a princely sum of $12,000 a year to live off of, and I was in the New York metro area, so I had to do a lot of work on the side just to kind of make do, just to be able to pay the rent. So I did a lot of teaching, I did some advising, I kind of. And my colleagues were all in the same boat. They did union organizing. They worked in different offices. That has changed in a lot of, I think funding packages are much more robust than $12,000. And but there's also an expectation that it does kind of limit you in terms of what you can do for the university. There's an expectation that you are working full time on your degree since the university is providing that. So it does limit that, but I think there's a lot of things that you can do on the side, both within universities. Here in the Life Design Lab, we have funded we have sort of paid graduate student workers, over the years. I know there's a lot of different opportunities to get connected on campus in sort of formal student employment roles, as long as you don't exceed whatever maximum is imposed. But when I was in graduate school, I think I got paid $1,000 to help organize a conference, a big sort of regional conference. The faculty didn't want to do it, so they sort of found some money and gave it to me. So that $1,000, paid rent for a month kind of thing. So there's those kind of side hustles you can do. But I think more so than using these side hustles to get by, these could actually be really, really valuable experiences. I used to be a PhD coach before I moved into this role. And when you talk to doctoral students and sort of thinking about transitioning to careers outside of academia, I'm interested in these other things. Very often it was their side hustles that gave them the experience, that gave them the connections, that gave them the skills to transition from working in lab research to going into science communication, because they'd help write some blog posts, or they were part of were a communications intern for some office. So don't, sort of look at these side hustles not just as ways to kind of help pay and help fund your education, but also ways to gain really valuable training and professional development skills that are going to help you no matter what career you go into.
Anything to add, Sara or Stephon?
Yeah. Some departments I was applying for, I don't know how standard this is across our university, but there are a lot of rules about what grad students can take on as employment outside of the university. I don't really know. So I think that if you find, first of all, I don't think you should apply to a PhD program if you do not know the stipend, because you need to do your mental math and figure out how much does it cost to live in Baltimore, how much am I going to get a month, blah, 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 and what other expenses and responsibilities and stuff you have. But given that, then you look at that stipend, you see, okay, if it's not livable, you can't apply there. If it is livable and you want to go, you can think about how to buttress that funding. And I think it's very important to find out what else you're allowed to do outside of the university, because some of them had very specific restrictions. I found out that, I'm pretty sure in my department, it's if you ask because you want to have another job, they might adjust your stipend or something, a lot of weird stuff. So you should for sure do not assume you can just show up and then do whatever you want in your free time, because there's a whole culture of your time is not your own in a PhD program. Recorded. I think that's really toxic. But in any case, you should for sure know what you're allowed to do before you signed your paper saying you're going to go there. All that being said, to internal funding, there's a lot of opportunities at Johns Hopkins. I just applied for and got a grant from the teaching, the Center for Education Resources, to make a little computational module for, I actually see some of my students from this semester here, like Shajay. We had a hard time doing CRISPR in our class that we took together, that I TA'd. So my co-TA and I decided to make this little computational module for it, and we got funding to do it. So now we get 300 hours of $15 an hour work to do it. So that'll be good for the professional development side, like Justin said, because it'll be a fun experience to make the little tool, but also money. So stuff like that you kind of, you need to look on all the websites basically and find out what these things are and what align with you. But yeah, knowing what you're allowed to do beforehand is really important. I've seen people get burned by that a lot.
To pick up on that, it is being recorded, but I'm at liberty to say this. I mean, I do think it is really, there's a sense that when you're in a PhD program, that any time not spent either sleeping or doing research is time wasted. So if you are doing some sort of project that you're getting a minor stipend for a community organization on the weekends, that can be, by some faculty, by some programs, it's why are you wasting your time with that? That could be time spent in the lab, spent in the archive. And I think that's, one, oftentimes these stipends, even though they're more than when I was in school, don't cover everything. The expenses come up, people have different needs. And sometimes you do need these side hustles in order to kind of continue to do your research, right? It's not just for flash money. It's sort of crucial for you to continue. But also it's just, your time, you need to start sort of thinking about those boundaries on your time and how you can use your free time in ways that benefit you, whether it's pursuing a side hustle, paid or unpaid, whether it's volunteering, whether it's doing some of this work. I think it's still important to keep that time. I do agree, though. I mean, there's still all sorts of rules in terms of what you can and cannot do, what you have to get permission for, what is too much, and so you do want to be careful not to run afoul of those rules. But I do think, as both a warning, but also encouraging you to sort of look for a program and sort of think about that, program, and in some cases a faculty mentor that's not going to view work that is, outside of the lab or outside of your particular research project as being a waste of time. Because I think you want to do other things and build up other skills, because I think it's important for you as a human being, but it's also important for you to develop as a scholar, as a professional. All right, I'll step off my soapbox.
That's okay. Thank you. So getting more into just logistics and some additional nuts and bolts about this whole process. So does securing funds from one grant or scholarship exclude students from receiving funds from other places?
A lot of the big government grad fellowships, I think, are exclusive. So I know if you receive the NSF, you can't take on any government funding from, I think, any other government entity until your period of being an NSF fellow has run out. I don't know about other ones.
Yeah, I would say most of the external funding agencies, if they give you more than, let's say, $8,000 or $10,000, they will have limits to say that you can't cherry pick and have $30,000 worth of funding from 4 different agencies. They're really good about following up, and you attest to it when you sign your award, right? You attest that you're not taking money from somebody else to do X, Y, and Z. I will also say institutions are very much the same way. You'll be surprised. We just talked about the rules that Justin and Sara talked about. Some of those rules are, hey, the biology department is giving you $12,000 a year to live on. You better not go to the chemistry department and take $6,000 from them to go teach classes. So there are these sort of rules that limits that individuals put on you. And that's why I say you have to diversify your portfolio, right? So you have to be willing to say, I have my research funding space, I have my academic funding space, then I have my personal life funding space. And you can then have 3 awards in those 3 areas that don't overlap, that aren't worried about the other one. And that's how you stretch the maximum of your grants and gifts.
There's almost its own panel about how to manage external funding. But first of all, if you get a big grad fellowship, keep your government or your grad program stipend. So I got the NSF and my mom was like, oh my God, this is great. You have $60,000 now. And I was like, no, I do not get money from my department anymore, even though they already allocated it to me. I only get the NSF. That is not a hobby thing. That's just the way it works. It was disappointing. But you can kind of negotiate those things. So my department, the biology department at Hopkins, if you get one of these sizable awards, they give you a one-time bonus. They also guarantee you that if our program funding outclips the funding you accepted from the other agency, they'll top you up. So my department is going to give me or whatever dollars because our program stipend is above the NSF stipend. That is not, those 2 things are not the case everywhere. They were not the case in most of the places I applied. So that's something to definitely learn. You don't want to accept an external funding and then be making less money than your peers because you had the opportunity of getting this wonderful external fellowship that your department benefits from. So that's something really important to ask beforehand. The other thing I've learned, it seems like it affects postdocs more than grad students, but sometimes depending on how health insurance works for these external fellowships, it changes your health insurance status with your department. So I think asking about whether your department will top you up and make sure you're making the most you possibly can, and checking about the health insurance are 2 very important things to ask when you're applying, because you want to get the external fellowship. They open other doors for these other programs you're eligible for. They look good on your CV. You meet other people. They're good for a number of reasons. You don't want to be in a position where you have to choose between the opportunity and the extra however much money because your department isn't going to match you.
Thank you. There was a good question asked in the chat of, can you apply for external funding a year or 2 into your PhD?
Yes, you can apply for external funding. And in fact, most PhD programs will likely encourage you to start thinking about external funding sources, particularly for the PhD writing or for the last 2 years in addition to. I also know there are a lot of R1 programs that only fully fund PhD students for 4 years. So 2 or 3 years, you're kind of at that point where like, hey, sink or swim, you got to find some money, or we're basically going to terminal you out, which give you the terminal masters, and you have to go find something else to do. So it's an important gesture to sort of really start thinking about after year 2, what are your external funding sources that fit your project goals and that fit certainly your professional goals and personal aspirations.
Most folks in my department, oh, sorry, Justin.
Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, I'm sorry. Most folks in my department don't apply for the NSF until their second year of grad school because the first year we're doing rotation, so it's harder to write the research statement if you don't know what lab you're gonna be in. We also in our department have a grant writing course that you don't take until your second year because it's specifically for those later fellowships in our field that you kind of aren't eligible for until you've been in grad school for 2 years. So it's just like the scope of the things or the list of things you can apply for changes. Like as a first year grad student, you're eligible for some that you're not eligible for later, but some more open their doors later.
I think it's also the same in the humanities and social sciences, right? There's an expectation, you know, especially if you need to do research overseas to a particular archive, to be looking at Fulbright, DAD awards, sort of external grants to fund your research years, and then very often looking at external awards to fund the writing up of the dissertation in the humanities and social sciences. So that's sort of expected, you know, that you are at least going to apply for some of these awards. And some fields, like, you know, in order to be, you know, quote unquote, a competitive applicant, you should get one of these awards. It's sort of a pre-test of your competitiveness. But yes, I definitely think it's not too late. In some cases, it's very much expected. So it's good to start, you know, going into a program knowing that just because you're fully funded, that doesn't mean that you're home free for the rest of your time.
Great. So are there, and this, I think each of you can answer this one. Love to hear your perspectives. Are there any additional tools, resources, or pieces of advice you wish more students knew about when thinking about kind of this process of being funded for grad school? Sara, we'll start with you.
Okay. I think talking to the grad students in any school you're considering would be really helpful. To Stephon's early point about a spreadsheet for applying to grad school, I had a huge spreadsheet. It had like every professor at any school in a city I would live in that I thought kind of even was remotely interesting. And of course I pared that down, and then I was lucky to exchange emails and talk to a lot of these faculty on the phone. And in some cases I talked to their grad students, and just like asking what the structure is in their department was so helpful to me. I think there are things that I could describe to you now from being in a grad department for almost 2 years that I would not have known to even ask them before. And so like just kind of asking the general question of like, how are students funded in your department? What's this landscape of funding? What is it? How much of it is external? How much of it is internal? How much of it is a like conglomerate or whatever? Asking the very specific department and the lab, if you can, that you're interested in, or the research group that you're interested in. I think those people just have the lived experience that they can kind of articulate it better than any question I could have asked 2 years ago. So talking to the grad students, I think is important. The other thing is that professors are always posting on Twitter that they have money for grad students. And I did not know that people used Twitter in that way until I was applying. And it was kind of like my timeline didn't really line up to really use that as a resource. But I think there are like a lot of hashtags that they use. And you can make a lurker Twitter, like don't do anything, just like look up these hashtags. You don't have to actually tweet yourself if you don't want to. But like if you just look at the hashtags like academic Twitter or whatever, you'll find pretty quickly the people in your field. You can also, as you look at the university websites, just go to the Twitters of the professors you might be interested in and kind of just see the professors of the same field also frequently like retweet each other. So one professor page might give you like 5 professors funding status. And they also like share opportunities in their field, like the American Genetics Association's grant is closing soon. They'll tweet that and then you can know it from their Twitter. So I think that's like a totally, you know, there's like a bunch of information gathering ways, but looking at somebody else's curated Twitter feed is one that I now think is very helpful if you wanted to look at it before you go.
Stephon, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the invite. I would say I think in the 4 years you've been an undergrad student, you tend to forget all the work you put in to get here to Hopkins when you applied as an undergrad. Grad school is no different. You're still some people have to take the GRE, which is the SAT times however many points you want to give it, all of those different things. But really what's important is you do have to put in a lot of legwork in terms of getting your own information and asking questions that are important to you about the places you're applying to. You could apply to a program that has great faculty, but has terrible funding and support for students. Like, I'm just going to be real. And that's just the way it is. Sometimes the best researchers you find give no money to students. They're just not, they don't have to. That's part of certainly their process there. But taking the time to do that work, I always recommend to every student applying to grad school that they should look into buying a book. So Don Asher, who's a renowned author in terms of graduate study, has a book called Graduate Admissions Essays and a book called Graduate School 101. Both of those go through the process of what the admissions process looks like and what admissions committees look like in the graduate school level. Also, what's important is for you as a student at a place like Hopkins to tap into your network. You can interview with a graduate school rep right now. So biology, like Sara, has a director of graduate studies who only focuses on admitting and supporting graduate students. Almost every department at Hopkins does. You can talk to that person about, hey, if I want to apply to grad school, what should I be thinking about in this field? What sort of questions should I be asking? And the earlier you do that, the better off you are at setting up your spreadsheet and then applying to graduate schools and meeting those graduate schools and talking to them in a way that shows not only that you know the information, but that you're prepared enough to know that they can't pull the cloth over your eyes, right? That you're awake and you're woke and you know what's going on. Not that all grad schools are predatory, but there are grad school programs that just don't think about, what types of things students need in terms of whether it's health insurance or funding or food or living. And so knowing those things going in helps you the better off choose a place that's really good for you, that offers the support you need.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking a lot about kind of fully funded PhD programs. But I know a lot of students are interested in master's programs, whether it's, education or, public policy or those kinds of master's programs. And I think, one, it's very hard to get kind of the fully funded package that we're talking about with PhD programs when you're looking at master's programs. At most universities, master's programs are revenue generation. They generate revenue. So in most cases, you're going to be paying some money out of pocket, either, for tuition, but then also looking to support yourself. And so I would just say, for me, just be very, very kind of mindful from the outset of like why you're doing this program and what you hope to get out of it for your career. Because I think there's an assumption that I think for a lot of students, they just assume, well, if a degree, master's or BA, BS from Hopkins is good, a master's degree from an elite institution is better, and I'm going to be able to make that money back. Because I think one of the things that we've seen, I've seen it in my own, I'm still paying off loans from my graduate studies, and I'm 12 years out now. So I think that there's this debt factor, that if you go to graduate school for a master's degree and take out $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 in loans, depending on the program, you might not, you might come out and not be able to really justify that in terms of a salary increase. And now you've limited yourself, right? If you're sort of paying $1,000 a month for student loans to pay off this degree, that kind of limits what you do. So just sort of be very, very mindful from the outset about that debt issue. Because I think it is a big deal. And it doesn't seem like it when you might be, if you do have to take out loans and you're signing the paperwork, you're like, oh, but I got, a $10,000 scholarship. I'm like, yeah, but you're still having to pay $40,000 a year over 2 years. It's a lot of money. So just be mindful about that. There's nothing wrong with saying, I'm going to take a couple of years and work to figure out if graduate school is right for me, maybe to save up some money. That is totally okay. That's probably actually a better thing, but it's totally okay. So don't feel pressured to go into graduate school before you can really kind of think through the financial implications of it. Because in addition to being, an incredibly valuable intellectual experience in most cases, it's a significant financial commitment. Even if you're fully funded, it's 5 years of your time that you're working for, $35,000 other than what you would be making. So, and not saving up for a house and not saving up for retirement. So just be mindful of the financial implications, even now when you first started thinking about it.
Very much agreed. You said exactly what I think all the time. It's a very expensive from a financial and time commitment to delay just figuring out what you want to do, which is usually what people use it for sometimes. A lot of times it's just like a stopgap. And so that's not the way. Taking some time to figure it out can be better. Okay, great. So a couple questions came into the chat while you all were sharing. One question, what about external funding from funding bodies, government agencies outside of the US? I'm an incoming international student and reported an external funding scholarship to the OIS in my department, but was told that the value of the scholarship will not be deducted from my stipend. It's also unclear to me if I'm reporting any external funding and the stipend as income to the IRS and the tax agency in my home country. So any perspective, I guess, on external funding from outside of the US and then also tax implications? Does anyone have I don't know who has the wisdom on this. And if not, if we have to direct them maybe to OIS or financial aid, that might be the answer too.
I mean, if OIS,
I would say,
go ahead.
I would say in this case, OIS would likely be the best place to start because the question and the implementation is really just the external scholarship sounds like it's coming in and it's counting not towards what they're already getting as a scholarship, but as income. And if that's the case, there are tax implications to that. If it was coming in as a scholarship, I would see that the department would accept it and then award it as a scholarship to the student. But those are two different processes that OIS would likely guide the student on trying to understand why it is which one and in which way the process works.
Gotcha. And then another question came in. I think it's a follow-up about the title of the book that you mentioned, Stephon. They didn't catch the author's name. And then also which office should I consult on application process if I want to ask more specific questions? So maybe the title and then also where they can find you, because you certainly can be helpful towards that process as well.
Yeah, so the author is Don Asher, D-O-N, Asher is A-S-H-E-R. If you just Google Don Asher, you'll find all his books on Amazon. They're available. For me personally, you can email me directly. That's sjhamell@jhu.edu. I will say I do have a couple copies in my office. I think I have like thousands of copies actually. But if you want to have a book copy to talk about or look at a chapter or just sort of offline, talk about different things, always available.
Awesome. Any last kind of words of wisdom before we close out? We have about 5 minutes left in our time together. So any additional words of wisdom that you all would share with our students as they're thinking about funding and money and not paying? What's one thing you wish you would have done differently on your own journeys in obtaining that additional education?
I think I would have maybe been thinking about the fellowships even earlier, so which I know sounds nuts at this point, but even earlier so that I kind of could have shaped my experience better to make a more compelling application, because you learn in grad school that and maybe you learn elsewhere also, that a lot of it is just grantsmanship. Like, it's how do you tell the story that is most compelling while kind of in the realm of true to the funder. And so you can kind of pick any angle and pull any thread of your actual interest, because we are, we all have more than one interest. And maybe the story you tell, like the Department of Energy, is different than the story you tell the DoD. And I applied to 3 big grad fellowships and I only got 1. And I think in retrospect, rereading those essays, you could totally tell which one I put my best foot forward. And it was also the one that I kind of had known about the longest and could kind of craft my story the best. And I think there's a lot of elements of like storytelling and story knowing and like knowing what you want to share and how to articulate it, that the sooner you know what the application's asking for, and if that's like a year out, you don't have to actually do anything. You can just kind of start thinking about how to frame the research you were going to do anyway, or the topic you were interested in anyway, for how it can be really like gel with the request for the RFP, the request for proposals from the agency that's offering the funding.
Before I turn it over, there was a quick follow-up question when you were, I think, writing something in the chat about how you spend your time in terms of making sure that the advisor in the grad program is knowledgeable about that. Someone asked, does it mean that they should discuss how many hours we could set aside for non-work time?
Okay, I had an extremely high bar when I was considering which faculty to even consider to apply for. And like, I'm so happy that I'm at Hopkins, and I'm so happy that I have the advisor that I have for all these reasons and more. But it was kind of horrifying talking to other grad students in other places, I guess, that like, I think these are conversations that are a little bit sensitive, and you should have them as close to in person as possible, which I think is going to mean video chat for most of the time, but video chat, phone, email, text probably before email if you have to text. But like, I would talk to the grad students of the faculty whose work seemed interesting, and you can kind of tell, and again, this doesn't apply to Hopkins, but like you can kind of tell like how the vibe is with the advisor in terms of like, if they refer to the advisor as my boss, that was a red flag to me. I'm like, they're not your boss, they're your colleague. Of course, I listen to my advisor. Of course, I hope to listen to him less as I get more independent, but I would never, he doesn't want to be my boss, and he's probably glad he's not. If they say stuff like, my PI lets me, or if they say, oh, I wanted to blank, but I didn't, I kind of would ask these really pressing questions. I also worked for 2 years before applying to grad school, so I had like learned how to like pull things out of people a little bit better than I knew before. But like, the thing to remember is that if you're talking to a grad student about their grad program or their advisor, even if that person wants to be honest, they are a biased source, because they have to live, they not only chose this life, but now they have to live it knowing that they live in Baltimore to go to Hopkins, or knowing that they only make however much a year to be in this program. So if they say anything that's like a little bit like, oh, I don't have that much freedom, or I don't have that much time, or I don't have that much support for my whole person, that should be a huge red flag, because that little bit of information made it past their screen of like coaching themselves through it. I'm sure I do it too when I talk about my experience, but everyone does it even if they don't want to. So you have to ask. I don't know that anyone would give you a straight answer if you said, how many hours can I set aside for non-work time? It's much more like, what does a typical week look like in the lab? Or, oh, what'd you do on the last couple of Saturdays? Like, and phrase it like, oh, what is there to do in Baltimore? What have you done the last few Saturdays? And if the grad student tells you, I was in the lab, I don't know any farmers markets because I'm not free during the mornings, like those tell you a lot about that work dynamic. That conversation crossed a lot of lab groups off my spreadsheet, just because I didn't think I would be happy in those kinds of places. But if you would be, then it's okay, I guess. There's definitely a culture of like lab first, nothing else second. And like, you want to try to make sure you don't accidentally get into that. I would be so happy to talk offline more about like specific questions to ask, but like really just asking them about their lives and getting them to talk about it and trying to see like how full is that life. Another thing I asked a lot of people was like, how much do you feel like you are a part of Johns Hopkins versus you are in the lab? Like, are you treated like a staff? Are you treated like a student? Are you in the community? Do you go to things? Do you know much? Of course, you won't be able to ask a first year student that this year, but because they maybe haven't even gone to campus. But like that conversation of like, oh yeah, I go to the free events on the lawn, or oh, my whole lab goes to the whatever. Those are really good answers, as opposed to, no, I don't even know where the gym is. Like I visited a school where like I asked like, do grad students get a gym membership? And like they didn't know. I was like, that's your very base level of self-care. So like, okay, I'm off my soapbox. Back to you guys.
Back to you. Well, we only have a couple minutes, so I want to, Justin or Stephon, if you do you have anything quick to add? Or
I'll just add something quick. I mean, I think what I wish I would have done differently would be to apply for more external grants.
Okay.
Because I think even if you don't get them, there's nothing like applying for an external grant to kind of hone your research agenda, really sort of like, this is actually what I am writing on, what I want to do, and what my professional goals are. And so it's just a really valuable process to go through. And I wish I would have done it earlier and more often, because I think it would have at least, even if I didn't get any of the awards I applied to, it would have focused my research and focused my professional goals earlier on in the process.
Great. Stephon, anything?
Yeah, really quick. I think for me, looking back, what I would have done was take the time to realize what I wanted to get out of the master's program. I went directly from undergrad to a master's program, and I look back and say, I could have really benefited from being an adult and working in the real world before I got to a master's program. to then be able to ask questions like, oh, can I live off this sort of work? How can I find more funding? On top of, is it really worthwhile for me to want to study this one thing I've learned in undergrad? Then you learn the world is larger than you could ever imagine. So taking that time, I think, really would have benefited me in probably being able to write a better personal statement of why I wanted to do X or why I wanted to do Y.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. And thank you to our panelists and everyone who joined us for this session. The next session begins at 11 a.m. and it's called How Do I Pursue Graduate School Abroad? So make sure that you log in for that. And we certainly just thank everyone for their time and insight, and have a great day. And thanks for joining the JHU Grad Camp.
Awesome.
Go.
Thank you. It's so nice to meet you guys.
Hi, good to meet you.